my stepson forgot his towel and walked out of the bathroom rock hard. It was just a typical day until Alex stepped out of the bathroom and froze me in my tracks. In that moment, the air between us shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. What do you do when an innocent mistake sparks something forbidden, something you can't control? As boundaries blur and desires ignite, the choices I made threatened to unravel everything I'd built. How will this end, with redemption or complete devastation? Stay tuned, subscribe to my channel, and let me know where you're watching from as I share this story of temptation, betrayal, and life-changing consequences. The moment my stepson Alex stepped out of the bathroom, everything I thought I understood about my life, my marriage, and myself seemed to shatter in an instant. I was passing through the hallway, arms full of freshly laundered towels, heading for the linen closet, when the door to the bathroom swung open unexpectedly. The room was still heavy with steam, curling out into the cooler air of the hallway, and there he was, Alex, his hair wet and mussed, droplets clinging to his skin like glistening beads. But it wasn't his freshly showered state that stopped me in my tracks. It was the unmistakable bulge in the towel, loosely wrapped around his waist, a detail impossible to ignore, no matter how much I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it. "Oh," I stammered, clutching the towels tighter to my chest, as if they could shield me from the sudden and mortifying intimacy of the moment. His eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite place. Was it embarrassment? Amusement? I wasn't sure. Sorry, I forgot my towel," Alex said, his voice low and casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. He made no move to cover himself further, standing there in the doorway with an air of self-assuredness that both unnerved and intrigued me. I averted my eyes quickly, my heart racing for reasons I didn't want to examine too closely. I've got extras here," I managed to say, my voice trembling as I fumbled to hand him one of the towels. My fingers brushed against his, and for a split second, I felt the heat of his skin. It was an innocent touch, but it lingered far too long in my mind. "Thanks," he said, his tone softer now, almost teasing. He took the towel, his eyes lingering on me for just a heartbeat too long, before he stepped back into the bathroom and closed the door. I stood frozen in the hallway, the scent of his soap and shampoo still hanging in the air. My cheeks burned with shame, but there was something else beneath it, something darker, something I didn't want to name. This wasn't the first time Alex had caught me off guard. There had been moments before, small things, the way he'd hold my gaze a little too long during dinner, the way his smile would soften when we were alone. I'd always dismissed them, told myself it was my imagination, that I was reading too much into nothing. But this was different. This was undeniable. As I turned and hurried down the hallway, my thoughts raced ahead of me. What had just happened? More importantly, why couldn't I stop thinking about it? I knew I was walking a dangerous line. But as much as I tried to bury the moment, I couldn't ignore the way it had made me feel. Alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that scared me more than anything else. Later that day, I found myself in the kitchen, mindlessly scrubbing a plate that was already spotless. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, replaying the earlier encounter with Alex. The faint scent of his shampoo seemed to linger in the house, and I couldn't help but feel hyper-aware of his presence upstairs. Alex had come into my life 5 years ago when I married his father, Mark. He was 17 then, all lanky limbs and teenage moods, barely acknowledging me at the wedding. Over the years, we had developed a cordial, albeit distant, relationship. He called me Karen, never Mom, which was fine by me. I wasn't trying to replace his mother. But things had changed in the last year. Alex had grown into himself. The lankiness was gone, replaced by a toned, athletic build that hinted at hours spent at the gym. His face had lost its boyish softness, his jawline now sharp and defined. In his demeanor, confident, almost cocky, was a stark contrast to the reserved teenager I had first met. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts creeping in. This wasn't right. He was my stepson, for God's sake. I focused on preparing dinner, hoping the rhythmic chopping of vegetables would silence the thoughts swirling in my mind. Mark was away, as usual. His job in consulting had him flying across the country more often than not, leaving me to manage the house and, by default, Alex. Not that Alex needed much managing these days. At 22, he was in his final year of college, only living at home between semesters to save on rent. As I set the table, Alex strolled into the kitchen. He was wearing a loose t-shirt and sweatpants, his damp hair still slightly disheveled. I avoided looking at him for too long, keeping my eyes fixed on the food. "Smells good," he said, his voice warm. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an ease that unsettled me. "Just some pasta," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Nothing fancy." He smirked, the corner of his mouth quirking up in that way that always seemed to make my stomach flutter. "Your pasta's always good." There it was again, that familiarity, that warmth. I hated how it made me feel, how it made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. I forced a smile and gestured for him to sit. We ate in relative silence, the only sounds coming from the clinking of forks against plates. Every so often I felt his gaze on me, but I refused to meet it. Instead, I focused on asking him about school, about his plans after graduation. "It's going fine," he said, shrugging. "I'm just trying to figure out what's next, you know? Feels like everyone else has it all figured out, and I'm just floating." "You'll figure it out," I said, genuinely wanting to reassure him. "You're smart, Alex. You've got time." He smiled at that, a genuine smile that softened his usually sharp features. "Thanks, Karen. That means a lot." I felt a pang in my chest, a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite name. I stood, quickly, collecting our plates and heading to the sink, needing to put some distance between us. After dinner, Alex retreated to the living room, and I busied myself with cleaning. But as the evening wore on, I found myself drawn to the couch where he sat, scrolling through his phone. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice more hesitant than I intended. "Not at all," he said, patting the spot next to him. I could use the company. I sat down, keeping a careful distance between us. We started watching some action movie he had picked, and for a while, it felt normal, comfortable. But then, he shifted closer, just slightly, and the air around us seemed to change. I tried to focus on the movie, but I was acutely aware of his presence. His arm resting on the back of the couch, his leg brushing against mine when he shifted. My heart raced, and I hated myself for it. At one point, he turned to me, his face inches from mine. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yeah," I said quickly, averting my eyes. "Just tired." He didn't press, but his gaze lingered for a moment before he turned back to the screen. I excused myself not long after, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom, where I spent the rest of the night replaying every interaction, every glance, every word. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance. I made sure to leave the house when I knew Alex would be around, filling my time with errands and unnecessary tasks. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted me. I started to notice things I hadn't before, how Alex's laughter filled the house in a way that made it feel less empty. How his compliments, even the casual ones, lingered in my mind longer than they should. I hated myself for noticing. Hated the way my heart seemed to betray me every time he was near. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, Alex walked into the room. "Need help?" he offered, his tone casual. "I've got it," I said quickly, not looking up. He didn't leave, instead sitting on the edge of the bed, watching me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. I froze, my hands gripping the fabric in front of me. "I haven't," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "You have," he insisted, his gaze steady. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not you. I've just been busy." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. Instead, he stood and walked to the door, pausing before he left. "If I did something, Karen, I'm sorry." As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the bed, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. How had I let it get to this point? How had a simple moment, a towel, a glance, spiraled into this? I told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about Alex. It was about me, about the emptiness I felt in my marriage, the loneliness that had crept in over the years. And Alex, with his warmth and his attention, had unknowingly filled that void. But filling that void came with a cost, one I wasn't sure I was prepared to pay. The tension between Alex and me was becoming unbearable, a silent weight that hung in the air whenever we were in the same room. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was misreading everything, but my body betrayed me. My racing heart, the heat that flushed my cheeks whenever he was near, the way I'd find myself watching him longer than I should. And then there was Alex, his gaze lingering a moment too long, his words carrying an edge of something unspoken. One evening, as the late summer sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the living room, Alex sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I was in the adjacent kitchen, attempting to distract myself with chores. The hum of the dishwasher, the clinking of glasses, it all felt distant, muffled by the whirlwind of my thoughts. I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep letting these feelings take root, but as much as I tried to push them away, they clung to me, relentless. "Karen?" Alex called from the couch, breaking through my spiraling thoughts. His tone was casual, but there was an underlying warmth that made my chest tighten. "Yes?" I replied, forcing my hands to keep moving as I wiped down the counter. "Come sit with me," he said, looking up from his phone. "You've been so busy lately. Take a break." I hesitated, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "I've got a lot to do," I said weakly, avoiding his gaze. "Come on," he insisted, patting the seat beside him, "just for a few minutes." Reluctantly, I dried my hands and walked over, sitting at the far end of the couch. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and for a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. "What are you watching?" I asked, nodding toward the TV. "Some documentary," he said, leaning back and stretching his arms along the back of the couch. His fingers were mere inches from my shoulder, and the proximity sent a shiver down my spine. "It's not that interesting. I just wanted some company." I tried to focus on the screen, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The warmth radiating from him, the subtle scent of his cologne. It was all too much. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, and I didn't dare meet his gaze. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a moment, his voice low. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, my tone sharper than I intended. I could see the flicker of hurt in his eyes, and it only made me feel worse. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his brows knitting together in genuine concern. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not you, Alex. I've just had a lot on my mind." He didn't press further, but his expression remained thoughtful. After a moment, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The weight of his concern, his sincerity, was almost unbearable. I stood abruptly, muttering something about needing to check on the laundry, and hurried out of the room. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as my thoughts raced. I couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening. But what was happening? Was it just me? Was I projecting my loneliness, my dissatisfaction with my marriage onto Alex? Or was there something more? The memory of the bathroom incident replayed in my mind, along with every lingering glance, every fleeting touch. My body betrayed me, responding to the thoughts with a heat I couldn't suppress. I buried my face in my hands, ashamed of the direction my mind was taking. I had to put a stop to this, had to create distance between us. But the next morning, when Alex greeted me with a warm smile and a casual good morning, my resolve wavered. "Morning," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone as I prepared breakfast. "I was thinking of heading to the lake later," he said. "Wanna come?" "I don't know," I said hesitantly. "I've got a lot to do around the house." He frowned, setting his phone down. "We're always working. Come on, Karen, take a break for once." I hesitated, the idea of spending the afternoon with him both thrilling and terrifying. But before I could respond, he added, "It'll be fun, just the two of us." Just the two of us. The word sent a jolt through me, but I nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay. Why not?" The lake was quiet that afternoon, the water shimmering under the sun. Alex had packed a cooler with drinks and snacks, and we set up a small picnic on the shore. For a while, it felt normal, easy, even. We laughed, talked about his classes and his plans for the future, and for a brief moment, I forgot about the tension that had been suffocating me. But then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the water, the mood shifted. Alex was sitting closer to me now, his knee brushing against mine. I tried to focus on the horizon, on the gentle lapping of the waves, but I could feel his gaze on me. "Karen," he said softly, and I turned to look at him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes searching mine. My heart raced, a mix of anticipation and dread. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong." "Then maybe you shouldn't say it," I said quickly, my pulse quickening. "But I need to," he insisted, his voice firm. because it's been eating at me, and I can't keep pretending it's not there. I stared at him, my breath caught in my throat. Alex. I know it's wrong, he said, his words rushing out now. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it, Karen. Stop, I said, cutting him off. My voice was shaky, my hands trembling as I stood abruptly. You can't say this, Alex. You can't. I'm sorry, he said, standing as well. I needed you to know. You don't, I said firmly, backing away. This can't happen, Alex. It's not right. He nodded slowly, his expression pained. I know. I'm sorry. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing by the water. My chest felt tight, my mind racing with emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. Back at the house, I locked myself in my room, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I had crossed a line and I wasn't sure if there was any way back. The house was oppressively quiet the next morning. The tension from the lake lingered in the air like an uninvited guest. I avoided Alex at all costs, retreating to my bedroom or keeping myself busy in the garden. But even with physical distance, I couldn't escape the echoes of his words, the way he'd looked at me, vulnerable and raw. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner. My movements were mechanical, my mind elsewhere. I was trying to convince myself that what had happened at the lake was a one-time slip, a fleeting moment of confusion on Alex's part and mine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound of footsteps startled me, and I looked up to see Alex standing in the doorway. He hesitated, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. Karen, he began softly, his voice tinged with hesitation. Can we talk? I don't think that's a good idea, I said quickly, my knife pausing mid-slice. Please, he said, stepping further into the room. I need to clear the air. I need to fix this. Fix this, as if it could be fixed. I sighed, setting the knife down and turning to face him. What do you want to say, Alex? He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze finally meeting mine. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, for what I said yesterday, for putting you in that position. I know it was wrong, and I hate myself for it. I swallowed hard, his apology cutting through me like a knife. I appreciate that, I said, keeping my voice steady. But we can't keep talking about this. We need to move on, Alex. I know, he said, taking a step closer. But I need you to know something. I wasn't just saying those things to make you uncomfortable. I meant them, Karen. And I know I shouldn't, but I do. Stop, I said sharply, holding up a hand. You can't keep saying things like that. It's not fair to me, to your dad, to yourself. His jaw tightened, frustration flickering in his eyes. I know it's not fair, but I can't help how I feel. Do you think I wanted this? That I planned for this to happen? Alex, I said, my voice softening, you're young, you're confused. These feelings, they're not real. They're just misplaced. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Misplaced? That's what you think this is? Yes, I said firmly, though the conviction in my voice wavered under his piercing gaze. And the best thing for both of us is to put distance between ourselves. So what? He said, his voice rising. I'm supposed to pretend this doesn't exist? Pretend I don't feel this way? Yes, I said, tears stinging my eyes. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Alex stared at me, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to contain his emotions. Finally, he nodded, his expression hardening. "Fine," he said, his voice cold, "if that's what you want." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing. Slowly, the days that followed were marked by silence. Alex avoided me, and I avoided him. We passed each other like ghosts, barely acknowledging each other's presence. The tension was unbearable, but I told myself it was for the best. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. I was in the living room, flipping aimlessly through a magazine, when Alex walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his face unreadable. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. I blinked, the words taking a moment to register. "Leaving? What do you mean?" "I'm going back to campus early," he said, shrugging. "I need to focus on school, and I think some space would be good." I nodded slowly, a mix of relief and sadness washing over me. "I think that's a good idea," I said, though the words felt hollow. He nodded, turning to leave, but then he paused, his hand resting on the door frame. "Karen." From behind her, she heard his breath inhale. "Yeah?" He turned back to face me, his expression softening. "I hope you know how much you mean to me, even if it's complicated." I felt my throat tighten, emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. "I care about you too, Alex," I said, my voice trembling. "But this can't happen. You know that, right?" He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I know." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of everything left unsaid. The next morning, I woke to find the house empty. Alex had left early, a brief note on the counter saying goodbye. The silence that filled the house was deafening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. But that calm was short-lived. That afternoon, as I was tidying up Alex's room, I found a small envelope tucked under his pillow. My name was scrawled on the front in his messy handwriting, and my hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, and as I read the words, tears streamed down my face. He poured out everything he hadn't been able to say, his feelings, his regrets, his hopes. He apologized for putting me in an impossible position, but he also thanked me for understanding him, for being there for him when he needed someone the most. By the time I finished reading, my heart felt like it had been torn in two. I sat on the edge of his bed, clutching the letter to my chest, and let the tears come. Letter 2. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Alex and I exchanged polite texts now and then, but we never spoke about what had happened. It was as if we had both agreed, silently and without question, to bury the past and move forward. But every now and then, when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I found myself thinking of him, of his smile, his laugh, the way he'd looked at me that day by the lake. It was a memory I both cherished and feared, a reminder of a line we had nearly crossed and a bond that could never be undone. It was a warm autumn evening, and the house felt quieter than usual, even though Mark had returned home after weeks away on business. We had slipped into our usual routine, distant pleasantries over dinner, brief updates about his work, and discussions about household logistics. But my mind wasn't in the conversation. It was still caught up in the letter Alex had left behind, its words etched into my memory. Mark didn't notice my distraction. He rarely did. He was engrossed in his tablet, responding to work emails while I cleared the table. The disconnect between us was palpable, but it had become such a normal part of our marriage that neither of us acknowledged it anymore. "Karen," Mark said, not looking up. "Alex called earlier. He mentioned he might come home next weekend." My hand froze mid-reach for a plate. "He's coming back?" I asked, my voice tight. "Yeah, something about needing to pick up a few things and take a break from campus life." I told him he's always welcome. I nodded, forcing a neutral expression as I resumed tidying up. My stomach churned at the thought of seeing Alex again. Part of me longed for it, while another part dreaded what it might stir up. That weekend came faster than I anticipated, and by Saturday afternoon, Alex was home. The moment he walked through the door, I felt the same rush of emotions I had been trying so hard to suppress. He looked good, relaxed, confident, and with an air of maturity that made him seem even more magnetic. But I kept my distance, greeting him with a polite smile and focusing on maintaining a sense of normalcy. Mark was oblivious to the tension. He was happy to have Alex home, and the two of them spent the evening catching up over drinks in the living room, while I busied myself in the kitchen. I avoided lingering in the same room for too long, afraid that Mark might pick up on something, even though he rarely paid close attention to me. Later that evening, after Mark had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I should have gone to bed, but I felt restless, as if I were waiting for something. And then Alex appeared in the doorway. "Hey," he said softly, his voice low so as not to disturb Mark. "Hey," I replied, setting my glass down. "Couldn't sleep?" He shook his head. "No, just thinking." The look in her eyes. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension between us was thick, the unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. "Karen," he said, taking a step closer, "can we talk?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Alex, I don't think—" "Please," he interrupted, his voice tinged with desperation. "I just need to say this and then I'll leave it alone, I promise." I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I know I messed up," he began, "and I know I shouldn't have said those things to you before, but I can't pretend that I don't feel this way. I've tried, Karen. I've really tried, but every time I think I've moved past it, something brings me back." "Alex," I said, my voice trembling, "this isn't right. You know that." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's not, but it doesn't change how I feel, and I think you feel it too." I looked away, tears welling up in my eyes. "You don't understand what you're saying," I whispered. "This is your home, Alex. Your family. You can't destroy that." "I'm not trying to destroy anything," he said, his voice breaking. I care about you, Karen, more than I should, and it's tearing me apart." The raw vulnerability in his voice cut through me, and for a moment, I felt my resolve weaken. I turned to face him, my eyes searching his. "Alex," I said softly, "you're young. You're still figuring out who you are, what you want. This is just a phase." "It's not a phase," he said firmly, "and you know it. I have one really important commitment." His words hung in the air, the truth of them undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. "Alex, don't," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, his gaze locked on mine, "but I can't keep pretending." And then, before I could react, he kissed me. Phew. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he were testing the waters. But the moment his lips touched mine, a flood of emotions surged through me. Longing, guilt, desire, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I froze, my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, leaning into the kiss, responding to the warmth and intensity of it. It lasted only a few seconds before reality crashed over me, and I pulled back abruptly, my hands shaking. "No," I said, my voice firm despite the tears streaming down my face. "We can't do this, Alex. We can't." "I'm sorry," he said again, his own voice cracking. I needed you to know how I feel." I shook my head, stepping back and putting distance between us. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "You need to go back to school, back to your life. This can't happen." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of pain and resignation. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll go." "Okay." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the weight of what had just happened. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, sobbing quietly as the enormity of the situation hit me. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And now everything was different. The next morning, Alex was gone. Mark didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, and I kept up the facade, forcing smiles and pretending everything was fine. But inside I was a mess. I couldn't stop replaying the kiss, couldn't shake the guilt and shame that consumed me. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to move on, to bury the memory of that night. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the way Alex had looked at me, the way his kiss had made me feel. It was a secret I would carry with me forever, a burden that would never truly go away. And yet, despite everything, part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if? The weeks following Alex's departure were some of the most tumultuous of my life. I had hoped his absence would create the space I needed to regain control, to bury the memory of what had happened between us. But instead, it only made the weight of it heavier. Every room in the house seemed to echo with his presence, every quiet moment filled with the memory of his voice, his touch, his kiss. Mark, oblivious as ever, carried on with his routines. If he noticed anything different about me, he didn't mention it. That was the thing about Mark. His lack of attentiveness was both a blessing and a curse. It gave me the freedom to wrestle with my emotions in private, but it also served as a stark reminder of why I had felt so disconnected in the first place. No, it was a rainy Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. I was sitting at the kitchen table, absently flipping through a magazine, when my phone buzzed. A text from Alex. My stomach twisted as I stared at the screen, debating whether to open it. Against my better judgment, I tapped the notification. He wrote, "Hey, I know I said I'd leave you alone, but I need to talk to you. Please, just one conversation." Alex sat. My hands trembled as I typed out a response. "Alex, we can't do this. It's better if we don't talk," I replied. His reply came almost instantly. I know, but it's important. I need you to know something. It's not about that night. Please, Karen, please. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let this go before it spiraled further. But another part, a part I hated to acknowledge, wanted to hear what he had to say. Against my better judgment, I typed a response. Okay. Call me. My phone rang seconds later. I took a deep breath before answering. Alex, I said, my voice shaky. Karen, he began, his tone serious. Thank you for picking up. I know I promised to leave you alone, but I found out something and I didn't know who else to tell. What is it? I asked, a mix of concern and curiosity. It's about Dad, he said, his words slow and deliberate. I didn't want to believe it at first, but he's been lying to you. I froze, my grip on the phone tightening. Lying? What do you mean? Alex hesitated before continuing. When I was home last time, I noticed something was off. I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof, but I found out he's been seeing someone. A woman. Her name is Lauren. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? I managed to choke out. I'm sorry, Karen, Alex said, his voice soft. I didn't want to tell you like this, but you deserve to know. I felt my world spinning, the foundation of my already fragile marriage crumbling beneath me. How do you know? I asked, my voice trembling. I saw messages on his phone, Alex admitted. When he left it on the counter, they weren't work, Karen. And I overheard him on the phone one night. It wasn't hard to figure out. Tears filled my eyes as the truth began to sink in. Mark, the man I had built a life with, the man I had stayed loyal to despite everything, was betraying me. The irony was bitter and cruel. Are you okay? Alex asked after a moment of silence. I don't know, I whispered, my voice breaking. I need to think. Karen, Alex said softly, I'm here for you, whatever you need. I ended the call quickly, unable to handle the mix of emotions swirling inside me. Betrayal, anger, sadness, and, beneath it all, a flicker of something I couldn't ignore. A sense of freedom. That night, Mark came home late as usual. I was sitting in the living room, my arms crossed, staring at the doorway when he walked in. He barely glanced at me as he set his briefcase down. Long day, he muttered, heading for the kitchen. Mark, I said, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. He paused, turning to look at me. Yeah. What? We need to talk, I said, standing. Now. His brows furrowed, but he nodded, following me to the kitchen. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or preamble. Who's Lauren? I asked, my voice sharp. Mark froze, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. What? You heard me, I said, my tone cold. Who is Lauren? He smirked. He stared at me for a long moment, his face pale. Karen, Don't lie to me, I interrupted, my voice rising. I know, Mark. I know everything. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, he said finally. It's not what you think. Oh, really? I snapped. So you weren't sneaking around with another woman behind my back? It's complicated, he said weakly. No, Mark, I said, my voice breaking. It's not complicated. It's simple. You cheated. He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. Don't Don't. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, his excuses trailing off into the silence. And in the days that followed, Mark tried to apologize, to explain, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. The trust between us was broken, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. For so long, I had been holding on to a marriage that felt like a shell of what it once was. And now, with the truth laid bare, I couldn't deny what I had been avoiding for years. I deserved better. Alex's revelation had been the catalyst, but it was more than that. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that I had been living in a state of denial. I thought about the connection I had felt with Alex, the way he had seen me, really seen me, in a way Mark never had. It was wrong, but it was also real, and that terrified me. A week later, I found myself staring at my phone, Alex's name highlighted on the screen. I hadn't spoken to him since that day, but I knew I needed to, not just for closure, but for clarity. When he answered, his voice was hesitant. "Karen?" "Alex," I said softly, "I need to see you." "Are you okay?" he asked immediately, concern lacing his voice. "I will be," I said, "but I need to talk to you, in person." There was a pause before he replied. "Okay, when?" "Tonight," I said, my heart pounding. "Can you come over?" "I'll be there," he said without hesitation. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth had already unraveled, and there was no going back. The hours leading up to Alex's arrival stretched endlessly. I paced the house, my emotions in chaos. Anger at Mark's betrayal simmered beneath the surface, but alongside it, there was an undeniable anticipation. Alex's voice on the phone had stirred something deep within me, something that scared me as much as it excited me. When the doorbell rang that evening, my heart jumped. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before opening the door. Alex stood there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his expression a mix of concern and hesitation. His eyes settled on my reaction. "Hey," he said softly. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside to let him enter. He moved past me into the living room, his presence filling the space in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I closed the door and followed him, motioning for him to sit. "I'm sorry for calling you like this," I began, sitting across from him. I didn't know who else to talk to." "You don't have to apologize," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I'm glad you called." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavily in the air. Finally, I broke the silence. "Mark's been having an affair," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Alex's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "I wish it weren't true." "So do I said, my gaze dropping to my hands. "But it is. And I don't know what to do about it." "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "Just take your time. Figure out what's best for you." I nodded, appreciating his support. But there was something else I needed to address, something that had been gnawing at me ever since that night in the kitchen. At times, I was confused. "Take a moment. Alex," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "about what happened between us." He looked at me, his expression softening. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know it was wrong, and I'm sorry for putting you in that position." It wasn't just you, I admitted, my cheeks flushing. I let it happen, and I've been trying to understand why ever since. My voice broke. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. I don't regret how I feel about you, Karen, he said finally. But I regret making things harder for you. I don't want to be another reason you're hurting. His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I met his gaze. You've never hurt me, Alex, I said softly. But this can't happen. You know that, right? He nodded, his expression pained. I know, but that doesn't make it any easier. We sat in silence for a while, the tension between us slowly giving way to a sense of understanding. Despite everything, there was a strange comfort in his presence, a feeling of safety I hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, I began to piece my life back together. Mark and I had long, painful conversations about his affair, about the cracks in our marriage that had led us to this point. He begged for forgiveness, promising to end things with Lauren and focus on rebuilding our relationship. But his words felt hollow, and I couldn't bring myself to trust him again. Meanwhile, Alex and I maintained our distance. We exchanged polite texts now and then, but I avoided seeing him in person. I knew it was for the best, but that didn't make it any less difficult. There were nights when I found myself staring at my phone, tempted to call him, to hear his voice. But I resisted, knowing that reopening that door would only lead to more heartache. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos in the attic, I came across a picture of Mark and me from our wedding day. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. I stared at the photo for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Somewhere along the way, we had lost that connection, that sense of partnership, and I wasn't sure if we could ever get it back. The next morning, I asked Mark for a separation. He didn't take it well. He accused me of giving up too easily, of not fighting for our marriage. But I stood my ground, explaining that I needed time to figure out who I was outside of our relationship. It was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made, but deep down, I knew it was the right one. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments. Mark moved out, and I began to settle into a new routine. The house felt emptier without him, but it also felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Alex reached out a few times, checking in to see how I was doing. His messages were brief, but there was an underlying warmth that always brought a smile to my face. I appreciated his support, even from a distance. One evening, months after the separation, I found myself at the lake where Alex and I had shared that fateful moment. The water was calm, the setting sun casting a golden glow across the surface. I sat on the shore, letting the cool breeze wash over me. I thought about everything that had happened, the choices I had made, the mistakes, the lessons. I didn't have all the answers, but I was beginning to understand myself in a way I never had before. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. A message from Alex. Thinking of you. Hope you're okay. I stared at the screen, a mix of emotions swirling within me. Finally, I typed a response. Yes, I'm okay, thank you. I hesitated before adding one more line. We should talk. Soon. His reply came quickly. Whenever you're ready. I set the phone down, a sense of calm washing over me. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. The weeks following my separation from Mark were a strange mix of liberation and loss. The house felt quieter without him, yet it was the kind of quiet that allowed me to think, to reflect on everything that had happened, not just in our marriage, but also with Alex. I had spent years in a marriage that, while stable on the surface, had been quietly eroding underneath. Mark's affair had forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding: the loneliness, the emotional distance, the growing realization that I had been more of a fixture in his life than a partner. And then there was Alex. His presence had awakened something in me that I didn't even know was dormant. I spent hours journaling, trying to make sense of it all. What had started as a confusing tangle of guilt and desire was slowly becoming clearer. My connection with Alex wasn't just about the physical tension that had flared between us. It was about being seen, being valued in a way I hadn't felt in years. He had noticed me, not as his stepmother, not as Mark's wife, but as a person. That realization was both empowering and terrifying. One rainy afternoon, as I curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed. It was Alex. "Hey, I'm back in town this weekend. Thought maybe we could meet up?" No pressure. I stared at the message for a long moment, my heart pounding. Over the past few months, we had exchanged polite messages, nothing more. But this was different. This was an invitation to open the door I had carefully kept closed. After a deep breath, "Okay, let's meet at the cafe near the lake." "Tomorrow?" His response came quickly. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. See you then." The next day I arrived at the cafe early, my nerves a tangled mess. The familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, and I chose a table by the window, hoping the view of the lake would calm me. I had forgotten for months that I had a family here. When Alex walked in, my breath caught. He looked older, more mature somehow, but his warm smile was the same. He spotted me and made his way over, sliding into the seat across from me. "Hey," he said, softly. "Hey," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, but there was also an odd sense of ease, as if the time apart had given us both the clarity we needed. "How are you?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "I'm better," I said honestly. "It's been a lot, but I think I'm finally starting to figure things out." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad. You deserve that." "And you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "How have you been?" "It's been weird," he admitted with a small laugh. "I've been trying to focus on school, on my future. But I think about you a lot." His honesty took my breath away, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Alex," I began, choosing my words carefully. "What happened between us? It was complicated and wrong in so many ways. The more I walked away, the distortions eased." "I know," he said quickly, "and I'm not here to make things harder for you. I needed to see you, to know you're okay." "I am," I said, my voice steady. "And I want you to be okay too. You're young, Alex. You have your whole life ahead of you. I don't want to be the thing that holds you back." "You're not holding me back," he said, his tone firm. "You've helped me see things more clearly. What I want, who I want to be." Ah, I felt a lump form in my throat, his words both comforting and heartbreaking. "And who do you want to be?" I asked softly. "Someone who can live with himself," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Someone who doesn't hurt the people he cares about." I nodded, my chest tightening with emotion. "You're already that person, Alex. You've always been." He smiled faintly, the warmth in his eyes stirring something deep within me. "I don't regret meeting you, Karen," he said. "I don't regret anything. But I know we can't go back to what happened. And I don't want to make your life harder." I reached across the table, my hand hesitating before resting on his. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking, "for everything." We spent the next hour talking not about the past, but about the future. Alex shared his plans to move out of state after graduation, to pursue a career in his field. I told him about the steps I was taking to rebuild my life, to rediscover who I was outside of my roles as wife and stepmother. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it left me feeling lighter, freer. When it was time to say goodbye, Alex stood and pulled me into a gentle hug. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "You too," I replied, holding him a moment longer than I should have. As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. This chapter of my life was closing, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. In the months that followed, I focused on myself. I started therapy, rediscovered old hobbies, and even took a solo trip to a coastal town I had always wanted to visit. The weight of my past mistakes began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope for the future. Mark and I finalized our separation amicably, and though the pain of his betrayal still lingered, I found peace in letting go. I realized that holding on to resentment would only keep me tied to a life I no longer wanted. As for Alex, he kept his distance, honoring the boundaries we had set. Occasionally I would see his name pop up on my phone, a quick message to check in or share a piece of good news. Each time, it brought a smile to my face, a reminder of the complicated but meaningful connection we had shared. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set, I reflected on how far I had come. The person I had been, the lonely wife, the conflicted stepmother, felt like a distant memory. I was still a work in progress, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the right path. Life was messy, unpredictable, and often painful, but it was also beautiful in its complexity. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. It was a crisp, sunny morning when I decided to revisit the lake where so many turning points in my life had taken place. Something about the water's calmness, the way it reflected the sky above, had always brought me a sense of clarity. That day I was seeking closure on my past with Mark, with Alex, and on the woman I had been when it all began. I parked my car and made my way down the familiar trail, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound breaking the stillness. The lake came into view, glittering under the autumn sun. It looked unchanged, timeless, as though it had been waiting for me. I found a spot near the shore and sat down, the cool breeze tugging at my hair. For a long time, I simply stared at the water, letting the memories wash over me. The last time I had been here with Alex, the air between us had been charged with tension and possibility. Now, the quiet was a welcome reprieve. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw Alex's name. For a moment, I hesitated. We hadn't spoken in weeks, each of us taking the time we needed to heal and move forward. But something about this moment felt right, like a final thread waiting to be tied. I answered, "Hey, hey," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Hmm? No," I said, smiling faintly. "I'm at the lake, actually." "The lake?" he echoed, his tone softening. "That's fitting." "Yeah," I said, brushing a stray leaf off my coat. I needed some time to think. "Me too," he said after a pause. "That's why I called. I wanted to let you know I'm leaving next week. I got the job I told you about." "Alex, that's amazing," I said, genuinely happy for him. "Congratulations." I heard Nayuk sigh. "Thanks," he said. "It's what I've been working toward, but it's hard to leave, harder than I thought it would be." "You'll do great," I said, my voice steady. "You deserve this." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you, Karen, for everything, for being there for me when I needed someone the most." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I kept my tone light. "You don't have to thank me, Alex. You've given me more than you know." "Maybe," he said, "but still, I'm grateful." "Ah, me too," I said softly. There was a long pause, the kind that felt more like a mutual understanding than an awkward silence. Finally, Alex spoke. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. When the call ended, I stared at the water for a long time, the phone still clutched in my hand. I felt a strange sense of finality, like a chapter had been closed. And that evening, I returned home to the quiet comfort of my house. It no longer felt empty, but full of possibilities, a blank canvas waiting for me to decide what to paint next. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to dot the sky. I thought about Alex, about the way he had seen me when I couldn't see myself, about how, in his own way, he had been a catalyst for change in my life. Life was unpredictable, messy, and often painful. But it was also full of growth, of second chances, of moments that reminded me of my strength. I didn't have all the answers, but I was learning to be okay with that, to trust the journey, even when the destination wasn't clear. A week later, as I sat on the porch, sipping my morning coffee, I received one final message from Alex. Alex said, "Heading out today. Thank you for everything. Be happy, Karen." I stared at the message for a long time, a bittersweet smile tugging at my lips. Then I typed a response. I replied, "You too. Be happy, Alex." I set the phone down, a sense of peace washing over me. The road ahead was mine to walk, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take the first step. As the seasons changed and life moved forward, I found myself returning to the lake from time to time, not to dwell on the past, but to reflect on how far I had come. The water, constant and unchanging, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in stillness, there is strength. One evening, as I stood by the shore watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. My life was my own again, and I was finally ready to embrace it. Because sometimes the hardest choices, lead to the most profound transformations. And in letting go, I had found the freedom to rediscover myself, to live, to love, and to begin anew. The world moves forward, no matter how tightly we cling to the past. It's a truth I've come to accept, one that has shaped my journey and guided me toward the woman I am today. As I sit here, pen in hand, reflecting on everything that has happened, I feel an overwhelming sense of peace. Not because the road was easy, but because I've finally learned to let go. Alex's departure marked a turning point in my life. It wasn't just about him leaving. It was about what his absence symbolized. His presence had been a mirror, reflecting the cracks in my marriage, my identity, and my sense of worth. And while our connection was complicated and unconventional, it forced me to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored. Mark's betrayal could have broken me, and for a while it did, but in the process it also gave me clarity. For years I had been holding onto a marriage that had been hollowed out by neglect and complacency. When it finally fell apart, I realized that I had been clinging to the idea of stability, not love. Letting go of Mark wasn't just about ending our relationship, it was about reclaiming myself, my sense of baton. In Alex, I found a different kind of connection. He saw me in a way that no one else had, and for that, I will always be grateful. But it was a connection rooted in pain, in longing, and in circumstances that were never meant to last. When I let him go, I wasn't just letting go of him. I was letting go of the parts of myself that had sought validation in places it didn't belong. I often think about that last message he sent me, the one where he told me to be happy. My days are quieter now, but they are filled with purpose. I've started painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. My canvases are a riot of color, reflecting the emotions I've kept bottled up for so long. I've joined a local book club, where I've found friendship and laughter in the company of people who value me for who I am, not for the roles I play in their lives. The lake remains my sanctuary, a place where I can reflect without judgment. Every time I visit, I'm reminded of how far I've come and how much further I have to go. The water's surface is calm, but it holds depths unseen, much like my own journey. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life is not about perfection. It's about growth, about finding beauty in the mess and meaning in the chaos. It's about forgiving yourself for the mistakes you've made and allowing yourself to move forward with grace and courage. To Mark, I leave no bitterness. What happened between us is a chapter in my story, but it is not the whole book. I hope he finds peace in his own way, just as I have in mine. To Alex, I leave gratitude. You reminded me of my worth, of my capacity to feel deeply, and of the strength it takes to let go. I wish you all the happiness in the world, and I know you will find it. And to myself, I leave hope. Farewell to the woman I once was, the one who doubted, who settled, who lived in the shadows of others' expectations. And hello to the woman I am becoming, the one who chooses herself, who embraces the unknown, and who carries forward with an open heart. Life moves forward, and so do I.